They brazenly lied to you about Ivan the Terrible all your life. They made a mad tyrant out of the Tsar. But this picture falls apart as soon as you look at the facts. Why do European officers, engineers, and doctors leave civilized Europe for wild Muscovy? How does the poor principality fight simultaneously for years against Livonia, Poland, Sweden, and Crimea and not fall apart? And if Ivan supposedly drowned Novgorod in blood, why does he then bring his family and the state treasury there? After these facts, it becomes clear. They lied not about the Tsar, they lied about the whole era. Imagine a country that Europeans call barbaric, a state where the ruler is supposedly surrounded by guards with severed dog heads and brooms tied to saddles. A place ruled by cruelty, dark medieval times, and technological backwardness. Yet masters from all over Europe come to this supposedly wild country. German engineers, Italian architects, English doctors, Scottish soldiers. Entire settlements are built for them, a German settlement in the very center of the capital. They receive salaries, sign contracts, and stay for years. Think for a second. When specialists leave the country en masse, it is a sign of decline. Remember Russia in the 90s. Brain drain, scientists leave abroad, sign contracts with Western companies. People run to where they can earn, where the standard of living is higher, where there are prospects. This is an economic law that always works. And now look at the 16th century. The flow goes in the opposite direction. European masters are going to Muscovy. They are not fleeing from it, they are going to it. Founders from Germany, gunners from Italy, doctors from England, Greeks, Turks, Circassians, Poles, all strive to enter Russian service. Why? If a bloody tyrant rules here, if there is barbarism and poverty all around, then why did the best specialists of their time come here? There is only one answer. Money. And money appears where there is production, technology, and a developed economy. No one will go to a country that cannot pay. No one will stay in a state without prospects. Therefore, Muscovy under Ivan the Terrible was a place where one could earn well. And this is possible only under one condition. There was a strong industrial base here. And here is where it gets most interesting. Let's see whom this supposedly backward country was fighting against. To the west, the Livonian Order, knight crusaders who were subordinate to the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, which later united into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Denmark, Sweden. This is the Western Front, and the war there lasted for 25 years straight. 25 years of continuous combat operations. To the south is the Crimean Khanate, which by that time had become a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century is a colossal power, stretching from North Africa to the Persian Gulf, from the Balkans to Arabia. One of the strongest military machines of its time. To the east are the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates, which were eventually annexed to the Moscow state. The territory doubled during the reign of Ivan the Terrible. From the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains, from the White Sea to the Caspian. This is not a principality. This is an empire. Now let's do the math. Fighting on several fronts simultaneously for decades requires monstrous resources. Every cannon needs cannonballs. Hundreds, thousands of cannonballs. Each cannonball needs to be cast, and for this, metal, foundries, and fuel for melting are required. Gunpowder, tons of it are needed. For gunpowder, saltpeter, sulfur, coal are necessary, and all of this on an industrial scale. Weapons for infantry, arquebuses, muskets, sabers, spears. Armor for cavalry. Supply wagons with food. Fodder for horses. 25 years of the Livonian War is not a raid, not a short campaign. It is continuous supply of the active army. Where was all this produced? Where were the mines? Where were the foundries? Where were the gunpowder mills? Official history prefers to avoid this question. We are told about the heroism of warriors, about the strategy of commanders, about diplomatic maneuvers. But they remain silent about where the material base for all this came from. Modern warfare requires 7 to 10 logistics personnel for every soldier. In the 16th century, the ratio was the same. For every musketeer, dozens of people are needed to provide everything necessary. Blacksmiths repair weapons, wagon drivers transport provisions, stable hands care for horses, and medics bandage the wounded. Without this infrastructure, an army will not last even a month. So, such infrastructure existed. A network of roads, warehouses, workshops, inns, fortresses where a garrison and supplies could be left, cities capable of receiving and accommodating troops. This entire system had to be developed long before the wars began. It is impossible to create it in a year or two. It takes decades, or even centuries. But about it, complete silence. As if the troops were supplied from the air and the cannons cast themselves. Either this infrastructure did not exist, and then it is impossible to fight, or it existed, but it was erased from the chronicles. And if it was erased, then there was something to hide. And one more detail that is hard to miss. They show us the oprichniki, the elite guard of the Tsar, his personal security, the bodyguards of the head of state. And how are they depicted? With brooms and dog heads, like highway robbers. An intimidating image, undoubtedly, but completely illogical. Look at the chronicles. The miniature of the year 1480, the standoff on the Ugra River. The drawing clearly shows firearms. The description explicitly states they shot arrows and hand cannons. The year 1480 is 90 years before the beginning of Ivan the Terrible's reign. Firearms were already in widespread use. Moreover, there is every reason to believe that hand cannons were used even at the Battle of Kulikovo. The year 1380 is the 14th century. If this is the case, then firearms existed in Rus for 200 years by the time Ivan the Terrible ascended the throne. Mounted shooters armed with muskets were a common occurrence. Artillery was used during sieges and in field battles. And so, with such a level of armament, the elite guard of the Tsar is depicted with brooms. Why? Because the musket is a sign of technology. It is a complex production, metallurgy, knowledge of chemistry for making gunpowder. And the broom is a symbol of barbarism. The image of savages who rely on fear, not on technology. The creation of this image was deliberate. It was necessary to portray Muscovy as backward, dark, and mired in cruelty. It was necessary to hide that advanced technologies existed here, because acknowledging the technologies means acknowledging that the war was not against barbarians, but against an equal opponent. And that is a completely different picture. But where's the evidence? Where are the facts that cannot be explained by the official version? They exist, and the most striking of them is connected with the event that went down in history as the Novgorod pogrom of the year 1570. Western sources depict horrifying details. Heinrich Staden, a former oprichnik who escaped from Muscovy, Johann Taube, and Eilert Kruse, who spent 6 years in captivity, an anonymous pamphlet printed in Frankfurt in the year 1572 with the loud title, A Truly Truthful Description of Events in Moscow and Russia. They all tell roughly the same story. Tsar Ivan arrived in Novgorod and organized a mass slaughter. 12,000 noble people were destroyed, 15,000 common people. The bodies were thrown into the river, which overflowed so much that the current stopped. The dead had to be pushed under the ice so they would not block the water. It sounds terrible, but if you look at the details, the picture begins to fall apart. All sources speak of the huge Volga River flowing through Novgorod. A large, famous Volga River, they write, which is twice as big as the Pregel near Königsberg. But in Veliki Novgorod, it is not the Volga that flows. In Veliki Novgorod, the Volkhov flows. The Volga is a completely different city, Nizhny Novgorod. This is basic geography that any school child knows. And Western publicists confuse the rivers more than once. In all texts, the same mistake. It gets even more. The brochure claims that the depth of this river was 8 fathoms. A fathom is a German unit of length, approximately equal to our Sagen. 8 fathoms is about 16 meters. But the Volkhov is a shallow river. There simply is no 16 meters of depth there. It is a physical impossibility. And finally, the most absurd thing. The river was filled with bodies from bottom to top, witnesses write. The current stopped. They had to push the dead under the ice. Try to imagine how many bodies it would take to stop the river's current. It is not just thousands, it is tens or even hundreds of thousands of corpses forming a dam. With such a number, the water would not be able to flow at all. The river would turn into a huge grave. All of this is outright fabrication. Moreover, the fabrication is so crude that it can be checked in 5 minutes using a map. But our modern historians take these texts at face value. They quote them as eyewitness accounts. They build entire theories about a bloody tyrant and the terror of the Oprichnina based on them. Why? Because these texts create the desired image. The image of barbaric Rus, mired in cruelty. And no one intends to verify them, because verification would destroy the entire concept. But the most interesting part begins later. 2 years after this alleged pogrom, an event occurs that completely destroys the official version. The year 1571. The Crimean Khan is moving towards Moscow. With him is a united army of Crimean Tartars, Nogais, and Ottoman troops. The threat of capturing the capital is real. Muscovites begin to evacuate. And Tsar Ivan the Terrible makes a decision. He takes his family out of Moscow, and together with his family, the entire state treasury. The entire gold and currency reserve of the country. Where, do you think, is he taking all this? To Veliki Novgorod. Exactly there. To that very city where 2 years ago he allegedly staged a mass slaughter. February of the year 1572. 450 sledges with the Tsar's treasury arrive in Novgorod. The treasury is placed in the cellars of 3 churches, Nicholas the Wonder Worker, Friday, and the myrrh-bearing women, under round-the-clock guard of the Streltsy. Think about the absurdity of the situation. The Tsar is taking his entire family and all the state's money to the city where he killed 27,000 people 2 years ago. He could have chosen Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, the official capital of the Oprichnina, where all the orders were transferred and where the printing house operated. He could have chosen Yaroslavl, Pskov, Vladimir, any other large city. But he chooses Novgorod, a city whose inhabitants, logically, should have hated him. They had a perfect opportunity to take revenge. The Tsar went south, throwing all his forces into repelling the Crimeans. Only the Streltsy guarding the treasury remained in Novgorod. And nearby, the entire royal family, defenseless, without an army. The people of Novgorod could at any moment seize the treasury, take the family hostage, negotiate any terms, or simply take revenge for the massacre. But they do not do this. Moreover, they guard the Tsar's property, protect his family, remain loyal. So, there was no massacre. Otherwise, such behavior is inexplicable. The Tsar trusted the Novgorodians more than anyone else, and he had reasons for that. In these same years, large-scale construction begins in Novgorod. The Tsar's court is built, covering an area of 14 hectares. This is half the size of the Moscow Kremlin. It is not just a residence, it is an entire administrative complex. Nominally, the capital is moved from Moscow to Veliki Novgorod. The Tsar does not ruin the city, he rebuilds it, making it a center of administration. Why Novgorod? Because this city was the capital long before Moscow, an ancient center whose roots go deep into the centuries. Moscow is the new administrative capital, created later. But Novgorod is the historical capital, a place where connections with the past had been preserved. Ivan the Terrible did not conquer Novgorod. He restored the connection with the historical capital of a vast empire. And here arises the question about the very name of this state. Officially, Ivan the Terrible held the title of Tsar of all Rus, not the Grand Prince of Moscow, but precisely Tsar. Tsar is the equivalent of emperor, the ruler of an empire, not a separate principality. But European sources persistently call him the Prince of Moscow. They lower his status from emperor to prince. They narrow the territory from all Rus to the Principality of Moscow. Why? To diminish the scale. To create the impression of a local ruler, not the head of a vast state. And the state was enormous. Under Ivan the Terrible, the territory doubled. From the Baltic Sea in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east. From the White Sea in the north to the Caspian Sea in the south. In size, it was comparable to the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest powers of that time. To admit this means to admit that they fought not with a barbarian principality, but with a powerful empire. It means to admit that this empire had technologies, resources, a developed economy, and this does not fit the needed picture. Therefore, the scale is understated, titles are distorted, and the country itself is depicted as a backward edge of Europe. But the resources were not taken out of thin air. The expansion of the borders had a specific goal: the protection of trade routes. Kazan had been raiding Russian lands for 100 years. It was a profitable business. The capture of slaves who were sold at foreign markets, looting of villages and towns. Hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved over the century. The annexation of Kazan in the year 1552 put an end to this slave trade. It was not a conquest for territory. It was the cessation of a constant threat, the destruction of the source of raids. After Kazan came the turn of Astrakhan, control over the lower reaches of the Volga. The Volga is the main trade artery, from the Caspian Sea across the entire country to the north. Goods from the east traveled along it: silk, spices, jewels. To control the Volga means to control trade, and therefore to have money to maintain armies and construction. The Livonian War in the west is a struggle for access to the Baltic Sea. Maritime trade with Europe, direct connections without intermediaries. Everything is tied to the economy, to trade routes, to the protection of these routes from constant raids. Not expansion for the sake of land capture, but the creation of a secure trading space. But trade requires infrastructure. Roads along which caravans move. Fortresses where one can stop and spend the night safely. Warehouses for storing goods. Workshops for repairing carts and harnesses. Inns, stables, blacksmiths. All of this had to exist. Otherwise, trade would be impossible. But about this infrastructure, silence again. As if caravans teleported from city to city and goods appeared by themselves. Either this infrastructure was crossed out, or it existed long before the official founding date of the Moscow state, and traces of this ancient system are visible throughout the territory. Star fortresses scattered from Scandinavia to Siberia. Official history explains them as defensive structures for artillery. The star shape supposedly allowed firing in all directions, creating zones of crossfire. But take a closer look at these fortresses. Their geometry is identical thousands of kilometers apart. The same angles, the same proportions, the same fractal mathematics in the layout. This is not a coincidence. This is a single system built according to one design. A modern analogy is printed circuit boards in electronics, or antenna arrays, complex geometric shapes that perform a specific function. Star forts are surrounded by water, Moats or canals. Water is not just protection against assault. Water is a conductor. For what purpose? For energy. These fortresses could have been nodes of an energy network that covered the entire territory. The domes of churches and cathedrals are not just architectural embellishments. They are capacitors and resonators. The metal crosses on them are antennas. Star forts, cathedrals, the system of channels, all of this is part of a single mechanism that worked until the catastrophe of the 18th century. After the disaster, the system stopped functioning. Only the buildings remained, but the technologies were lost. The new inhabitants did not understand how it all worked. They saw fortresses and called them defensive structures. They saw cathedrals and considered them places for prayer. But the true purpose was forgotten. Ivan the Terrible lived in an era when this system was still functioning. He did not build it from scratch. He used what already existed. The infrastructure of an ancient empire, whose roots go much deeper than the official chronology. An empire called Tartary. And now, understanding the scale of this system, one can return to Western testimonies and see them in a new light. Heinrich Staden, Taube, Kruse, all of them wrote after fleeing Muscovy. All received money from enemies, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, remnants of the Livonian Order. Their task was to create an image of a barbaric state. The method is simple and effective. Monstrous details that evoke horror. 50 naked women in the frost. Children tied to their mothers and thrown into the river. Bodies filling the river to the brim. Details so shocking that the reader does not think to verify the facts. He simply is horrified. This works even today. Propaganda materials always appeal to emotions, not logic. It does not matter whether it is true or false. What matters is the impression it makes. And after 450 years, these texts have become historical sources. Scholars refer to them, and they are quoted in textbooks. Why do modern historians not check basic geography? Why do they not ask the question of how bodies can stop the flow of a river? Because checking would destroy the concept. The concept of dark Rus, backward Muscovy, a bloody tyrant on the throne. And this concept is needed. It is needed to hide the truth. The truth that Muscovy under Ivan the Terrible was a technologically advanced empire. That there was an industry here capable of supplying armies for decades. That there was infrastructure here inherited from a more ancient civilization. That the Holy Roman Empire was not fighting barbarians, but an equal opponent. To admit this means to admit superiority, and that was unacceptable. Therefore, 100 years after the events, the image of the terrible tyrant is created. Instead of a commander who doubled the territory of the state, instead of a builder who rebuilt cities, a bloody maniac with a persecution mania. And the saddest thing is that the Russians themselves believed in this black legend. They are ashamed of their history, apologize for their Tsar, and accept the Western version of events as the truth. This is called internal colonization. When a people stop being proud of their past, they lose their future. But stones do not lie. Artifacts remain despite all attempts to rewrite history. Coins from the era of Ivan the Terrible are found in large quantities. They bear symbols, titles, inscriptions. Fortresses still stand, and their geometry speaks for itself. Remnants of roads, foundations of industrial complexes, traces of ancient metallurgy. All this contradicts the official version of the poverty of the era. The quality of metal processing, methods of stone laying, architectural solutions, all require technology. Technologies that supposedly appeared only in the 19th century. But they were here in the 16th. And if you dig deeper, then also in the 15th, 14th, 13th. Where did they come from? Who created them? The answer leads to a civilization that existed before the official chronology. to an empire whose borders stretched from Europe to the Pacific Ocean, to a system that operated as a single whole, to Tartary. Ivan the Terrible was not the beginning of this story. He was its sunset. The last ruler who could still use the ancient infrastructure, ancient technologies. After him, a catastrophe began. The 18th century brought destruction that completed what had started during Ivan the Terrible's lifetime. And all that remains are buildings without explanations, fortresses whose purpose is forgotten, cathedrals whose domes are silent, and texts written by those who wanted to hide the truth. Texts that became history. History that we are obliged to believe. But facts are a stubborn thing. 450 sledges with the treasury in Novgorod 2 years after the massacre. Migration of specialists to the supposedly barbaric country. 25 years of war on several fronts without an apparent industrial base. Firearms 200 years before Ivan the Terrible. All of this does not fit into the official picture, and the more you look, the more discrepancies there are. The truth does not lie in eyewitness testimonies. It lies in stone, in metal, in the earth, in that which cannot be forged or rewritten, in artifacts that continue to be found, despite all attempts to hide or explain them. History is written by the victors, but the victors are not omnipotent. They can burn books, rewrite chronicles, create a convenient version of events, but they cannot change the laws of physics. They cannot make rivers flow where there are none. They cannot explain where the production for a multi-year war came from. They cannot hide the traces of an ancient system which is visible in every star fortress. And when all these discrepancies come together, a picture emerges. A picture of a world where official history is only the surface, and beneath it lies a past about which we know almost nothing. The past of a great empire whose technologies were lost, whose cities we still use today, whose infrastructure we call our own. Ivan the Terrible was part of this world, the last flash of fading greatness. After him came darkness, from which we have not yet emerged. The darkness of ignorance, the darkness of false history, the darkness of oblivion. But light breaks through the cracks, and it is enough to look where they do not want us to look. At artifacts, at discrepancies, at unanswered questions. Because where the official version is silent, there lies the truth. I am not trying to impose on you the only correct version of events. I do not claim that everything happened exactly as described here. My task is simpler, to show facts that do not fit into the usual picture. 450 sledges with the treasury. Rivers that are not on the map. Migration of specialists to an allegedly backward country. Star fortresses with identical geometry on different continents. All this is not fiction, not fantasy. These are documented events and physical objects that still exist. What to do with this information is up to you alone. Subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell so you don't miss new investigations. There are still many mysteries and discoveries ahead. We will continue to look for clues, ask uncomfortable questions, and explore what official science avoids. Because the truth is always nearby. You just need to want to see it.